Hello and greetings. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the oughts and shoulds of therapy. And what I'm referring to is a lot of the messages that we've picked up either through our initial training or as we have developed as therapists about what we should be doing, what we ought to be doing as therapists, particularly when it seems there's a conflict in what we'd like to do. Big thing with a lot of these shoulds and oughts is that they're handed to us sometimes by well-meaning people that we respect, and I think we should always keep, here's a should, should always keep an open mind about the information we're being given. At the same time, I think it's important that we question whether what we're being taught is really applicable in every situation. Let me give you an example. I was taught that you rarely ever touch your client. You rarely ever, other than a handshake, you rarely ever hug your client or anything like that because it could be misconstrued. And particularly as a male with a lot, female clients, I have to be extra aware of that. But there are times when that is initiated by the client, or it just may feel like that's a healing thing to do. So that's a situation where a lot of us, we're in these little dilemmas. We call them ethical dilemmas, but they're not always ethical dilemmas. They're really just someone else's opinion about the best way to handle certain situations. A lot of this may come through the individual theory or school of thought you were brought up in. If you're from a strict psychoanalytic background, you don't show emotion, you don't self-disclose, you don't, you know, really open up and be as honest as you can about things because, that's just not how a lot of that system works. So, what do we do here? Well, part of the problem is that we get so afraid and that something that we're going to do may cause some, difficulty for us or the clients, and maybe we don't take what I call calculated therapeutic risks when we feel we could. So sometimes when a situation warrants us being more authentic or more confrontational or less confrontational or doing something totally random and unexpected and that people would never understand unless they were in that moment, it comes back to us examining what our oughts and shoulds are. You ought to never do X in therapy. Now, I want to differentiate here. There's ethical, legal things that we all want to follow if you're a therapist or coach, but then there's things that we call the gray area. So, should you never tell your client that you're angry with them? Should you never show emotion? Should you never hug? Should you never hand a tissue rather than point where they are? So I think we really need to examine all these oughts and shoulds. So what I recommend, if you're playing with that, write down some of these that sometimes you're a little confused about. And then write where specifically you learned that that was not okay. Now, again, not legal, ethical things. Things like calculated self-disclosure. If they said, well, you never do that, where'd you learn that? And just because that source of information may be right on other things, is it possible that it might not be right? Are there certain specific areas that source of information might have not thought about? And again, I'm not telling anyone what's right or wrong to do, but if we want to have the courage to be as creative and improvisational and spontaneous as needed in that session, we have to become more flexible. And what hampers flexibilities is when we take on oughts and shoulds from outside authorities that we've never directly examined for ourselves. If we're asking our clients to examine their oughts and shoulds, I think it's incredibly important that we examine the ones we have. I remember I worked with a lady many years ago who was actually a clinical supervisor, and she would always say this, well, that's unethical. She would use that term, and she would be saying it for things that was not an ethical dilemma. It was just this knee-jerk response. So her trainees were kind of almost afraid to do anything because she would see any gray area as this, right or wrong, dichotomy of things, as opposed to, sometimes it is okay to cry in front of your client. Sometimes it's not. As my mentor Bill O'Hanlon says, I do that every time in therapy, except when I don't. Right? You want to have that kind of flexibility and to really sit down and examine, is it really that rigid if it's not a legal, ethical guideline set down by our state boards and accrediting bodies? What's the flexibility there? So it's a great thought experiment to just to kind of play with this. Where did I learn it from? And is that always the case? And always is a very um, limited term. So just kind of putting it out there. If you can think of some ideas you'd like to share, please feel free and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great day.